Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about what is the perfect level of transparency you have in customer support. And we're going to be joined by our colleagues at Baremetrics to give this presentation to you. My name is Gary McGrath, and I'm the Customer Success Consultant at Kayako. And I make sure that our staff have the tools that they need to actually support our customers and actually help our customers get better at customer service. And then we'll have Kaegan here as well, and he'll take you through what he does at Baremetrics in his role at the Chief Happiness Officer at Baremetrics. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Kayako first. So Kayako is basically a customer service platform, and we're serviced by about 35,000 organizations around the world that we actually offer our software to. We help their customers with all their kind of problems that they deal with. So let me go ahead here and pass this over to Kaegan to take you through what he does at Baremetrics.
So yeah, as Gary mentioned, we're going to be talking today about the perfect amount of transparency for customer support. So my name is Kaegan. You can find me on Twitter at Kaegan, and I work for a little company called Baremetrics. Some of you guys might have heard of us, some of you may not have heard of us. But basically what we do is we provide insights for Stripe-powered subscription businesses. So if you've got a business and you've got Stripe, with one click, you link in all your data, and we turn that into metrics that tell you about the health of your business. So things like monthly recurring revenue, lifetime value, churn, and those sorts of things. Here's a glimpse of the Baremetrics dashboard, which you can find at demo.baremetrics.com. One thing that makes us a little bit different is that our public demo uses real, unaltered numbers. So you can see our real-time revenue, our monthly recurring revenue, even down to like individual cancellations. Of course, we don't show private user information. Everything's completely anonymized, but otherwise, everything's all there. And we're not the only ones doing this. Today, we run the Baremetrics Open Initiative, and we help other companies like Ghost and ConvertKit share their financial metrics publicly. So this represents now $15 million in annual recurring revenue across 14 different SaaS businesses, which is crazy. Crazy amount of money. Kind of an interesting side note, we originally went public with our numbers partly because we needed to build a demo, and it would take a lot less time just to anonymize our information than to build a bunch of tests or like a bunch of sample data. So on the one hand, we wanted to be transparent, but on the other hand, it also just made the most sense to do that. And ever since then, it's completely taken off, which is really, really exciting for us. So we've taken that transparency ball and we've sort of started to run with it. Almost all of our blog posts are related to things that happen within the business that normally wouldn't be discussed externally. So here's a blog post that we did where we went into the tiniest detail about how we spent $250,000 in 4 months. This blog post actually was a big inspiration for me. So less than a month after I was hired for customer support, our founder, Josh, published a 3,000-word post going into detail about how he hired me, which was sort of a weird thing. Normally, you don't really get to see like inside your own hiring process. And what this did for me is it served as a bit of inspiration. So just as Josh was really transparent in this blog post, I wanted to do that same thing with customer support. Here's an example of how we've done that. So we ran an NPS survey on 50% of our customers, then we released a new feature, and then 6 hours later we ran that same survey on the other 50% of our customers. Lo and behold, customer loyalty increased by 125% just by releasing a new feature. Pretty neat. It's not very uncommon for customers or for companies to run A/B tests and experiments on their users, but it's certainly a little bit unusual to publish the results of those tests, and that's something that we've done here. Here's another blog post that I've done. We like to give away kind of our secret sauce as much as possible. So one of our most popular blog posts here details how to automate the process of NPS collection and following up with those surveys automatically using Promoter and Zapier. And another very popular blog post is I detailed how we use GIFs on Twitter to announce new features or to highlight lesser known features. And what we found is that tweets with GIFs have about 5 times more engagement than just a static image, which is pretty neat. anyhow, that's kind of just a quick overview of myself and Baremetrics and where we come from. So we can just go ahead and jump into the discussion now.
Three things we're going to have a chat about today in terms of transparency for customer support. We're going to ask kind of what are the dangers and expectations that might come with publishing your metrics, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. We'll also look at handling customer expectations and doing things like special requests for them and maybe your service limitations as well. And then thirdly, we'll look at being transparent at kind of like the worst time for your company. So kind of when things have gone wrong, so you've had an internal disaster, something bad's happened, and how do you be transparent about that as well? So first and foremost, let's look at the first question, which is the dangers and expectations that come with publishing your metrics on your website and what are the benefits of that. So the first one we have here is the dangers of publishing your CSAT scores. And so when I look at this here, I kind of think there's two ways that you can look at this, because your CSAT is either going to be high or it's going to be low. And I guess you kind of got benefits and kind of issues with either of those depending upon if they're high or low. And so I don't know what you think, Kaegan, in terms of what are maybe the benefits of publishing your CSAT if it's really high?
Well, I think first of all, if you're a B2C company, so you're primarily dealing with consumers, one of the concerns that I would have is that you would publish a CSAT score and folks aren't going to know what they mean. You know, they don't know that, like for example, like a CSAT score of 30 to 40 is pretty good, but that doesn't sound good to, I think, the average consumer. So I would hesitate there if you're dealing primarily with consumers. Baremetrics is dealing mostly with other businesses, so I think it's a benefit for us to publish our CSAT scores because it helps set a benchmark that other companies can aspire to or try to do better at, or maybe pat themselves on the back because they're already doing a better job than us. But to your point about, I guess if the CSAT score is quite low, then you can kind of create this feeling amongst your customers like, oh, like, you know, other people aren't happy, maybe I shouldn't be happy as well. That's really just a hypothetical, though. We haven't experienced that as far as I know, but that would be a hypothetical concern for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's other concerns you can have as well, which maybe are not so obvious. So if you take maybe you've got a really high CSAT score, there are kind of like benefits to that, obviously, because people can see that you're doing well, but at the same time, it can possibly set expectations for the customer to expect some kind of like wow experience when they're contacting your support, and obviously that kind of leads to its own internal pressures, and you then try and live up to your own kind of CSAT score, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. If, you know, and especially if you're super transparent, and the customer says, "Oh, well, you know, 97% of your customers are happy, and I'm not happy, so make me happy." And, well, maybe what you're asking for isn't realistic or not something that we offer, right? So sometimes setting that bar for yourself can be a little bit tricky, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And then obviously, if you do have your low CSAT score, I think maybe like the biggest problem you have there is if a customer sees that most of your customers are having a poor experience with you, do they bother to actually submit the problem to you? You know, if they don't feel they're going to get the help that they need, they might not even bother asking. And then you kind of got like self-perpetuating like bad customer service effectively simply because they're not actually contacting you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like certainly from my perspective, from the Baremetrics perspective, we would lean towards transparency and just releasing those numbers anyway. And you know, we've just found that whenever we kind of are wishy-washy, is like, oh, should we say this? Should we not say this? And we wind up just being transparent about it. The end result is never as bad as what we thought it could be. You know what I mean? Like there's always these concerns that run through your head, and then the actual thing that happens is not really that big of a deal. So
yeah, I mean, if you do publish them, and let's take an example and say they're not brilliant, but they're not like terrible either. It kind of does set a benchmark for you to kind of live up to and try and improve that. And obviously, if customers are tracking that, they'll see it over time. You're actually making effort and getting better, and that actually might breed more loyalty with your customer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think you would ever just publish your CSAT scores and be like, here are the numbers, bye. You would, you know, if you had a low score, you'd publish a blog post alongside that saying like, oh man, like these are the things we need to work on. Here are the steps that we're taking, and kind of like you mentioned, you're showing to your customers that you're committed to improving, and hopefully they will see that in interactions. So, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the way to go.
Okay, cool. So the next thing we have is about average handling time. I guess this is kind of two ways you can look at this. There's obviously kind of like the initial response or your first response time, and then you have the kind of time that it takes you to kind of resolve that customer's problem from kind of start to finish. And those are kind of like two like handling times, which I think are kind of the ones that you publish if you were going to publish those kind of things. So I think there's a good side of publishing this myself because it kind of lets your customer know what to expect. And so if, for example, you posted and said, our response time is going to be 2 hours, the customer knows it's going to be 2 hours before you get back to them, and so they're not left hanging. They know when to expect that help, and they know it's going to be fairly quickly. But of course, you're going to have the cases where some customers, or at least some companies, maybe I'm going to guess you've had it on emails. You'll submit an email and they'll say to you, we'll get back to you within 48 working hours or something, and you're kind of like, that's just massive amount of time, and I wish I hadn't submitted now because it's not going to resolve the problem that I have now. And so I guess those are the two dangers of handling time.
And I think some companies kind of make this mistake of they say, oh, let's underpromise and overdeliver. So they'll say something like 48 hours, and then they'll be really happy that they've managed to do it in 2 hours. They're like, oh, we surprised and delighted, to use a term I picked up at Apple. But in that case, okay, sure, you beat expectations, but you set a really negative expectation to begin with. So I don't think that's necessarily the way to go. The other concern I have with being transparent about this is that usually you're reporting the median response time. So say your median response time is 2 hours. Well, that still means that half of your customers waited more than 2 hours. Yeah, so you might be setting an expectation that you're not going to be able to meet for half of your customers. So you have to be really careful about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, if you kind of expand on that, I guess the question then becomes, is that a metric that you want to publish to customers? Because also as well, it'll also vary kind of depend on what time of day they contact you. And so, for example, if you're not 24/7 and you're only open 8 hours a day, then obviously the customers that are submitting their problems at the end of the day might actually be waiting an awful lot longer for those responses too.
Yeah, I think if you are going to publish that number, you definitely have to set a range. And I've seen a lot of companies that will say our business hours are X through Y. Baremetrics is still pretty small. We just crossed the 500 customer mark a few days ago. Thank you. That was a big milestone for us. So most of our customers, we know them really, really well. So and I know all of them on a first name basis, and they know that I'm in North America, and they know that if they're writing after a certain time, they're probably not going to get a response until tomorrow. So that I'm lucky in that sense that I haven't had to go out of my way to publish our response times or working hours or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think kind of maybe the lead into that is really make sure that you're setting the expectation correctly. So don't just publish a number. Explain some of the metrics behind that and how it was generated, so customers know kind of more realistically what to expect.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was recently, but I submitted a ticket with somebody, and they said we get to 80% of our support requests within 2 hours or something like that. And I liked that, right? It was okay, so there's a pretty darn good chance I'm going to hear back within 2 hours, but I might not. Okay, great, I can work with that. As opposed to, our median response time is 2 hours. Well, how many people end up waiting 2 days? I don't know. Could be the other 50% of it. Could be the other 50% of the customers are waiting 2 days, right? That's how medians work. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think.
Okay, so let's move on to the third one here. And so, in terms of publishing your NPS, for me, the first question that comes to mind is I'm not sure of the big benefit of this in my own mind, because I'm not sure how many customers know what NPS is, and therefore if you publish that score, they might read it wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I said a very similar thing earlier when in my head I was thinking NPS, and that is so true, because I mean even when I first learned about NPS, it took me at least a day to wrap my head around what it was telling me, right? It's a very interesting metric to calculate. As I mentioned before, I think if you're dealing primarily with other companies, it's fine to release it because the people that you're dealing with will probably know what it is as well. If you're a business-to-consumer company, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to release that number, just because it doesn't have any weight.
Yeah. I also feel as well, especially with things like NPS, if people are aware of what it actually means and they've read that NPS score, it can kind of be like self-perpetuating. And so if you've got poor NPS and people know you've got poor NPS, if they get like an NPS poll, they're more likely to actually rate it negatively. And so kind of you actually make it kind of deflect the true ratings of your NPS, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I can see that happening as well. Have you guys, have you experienced that, or is this more of a hypothetical thing?
It's a hypothetical thing. We've never published our NPS, simply because, for the reason we said, really, a lot of our people, our customers are actual kind of customers, and so they may not actually understand what NPS is. If they do understand it, we don't want to kind of like change the way and give them bias on how they're viewing us before they actually enter that NPS score.
Yeah, we get a lot of that too because we're dealing with other business owners. Sometimes people in the comments will be like, they will straight up just say, they'll give you an 8 and they'll be like, yeah, I'm a passive. You know, if you did this for me, I would definitely be a promoter. And it's like, you know what I mean? It's like they know exactly what information we're trying to gather from them.
Yeah, they know the game.
Yeah, they know the game. They play the same game too. But I've yet to have anybody, you know, just be like, you know, give us a detractor score with like a winky face in the comment section, just being like, I got you. That hasn't happened yet, thankfully. Now that I've said it, some people do it. Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool. So let's move on to our second question.
Cool.
And this one's basically handling customer expectations and maybe some specialized requests that you might get. So I guess when we're saying that, we might be talking like feature requests if you're a software company and things like that, and maybe some service limitations you have as well. And so on this one here, I think sometimes it can be more how to let them down, if that makes sense, because typically maybe you'll get a feature request come in and you know that isn't really on your roadmap for your product, for example, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, well, how do I let this customer know that we're not going to do that, but like kind of let them down in a gentle way? I don't know if that's kind of like something that you've experienced in Baremetrics.
Absolutely. So Baremetrics, what we're trying to do is take, 30 different ways of using Stripe and 30 different, like all these different ways of running SaaS businesses and trying to create a set of metrics that will work for all of them. And of course that's hard, right? And so what we're trying to avoid is we don't want to just start creating a bunch of niche features to, like, oh, these 5% of customers are going to need this and these 5% of customers are going to need that, because then eventually you end up with this like bloated mess of a product. So a lot of the feature requests that we get are of that variety, right? Where it'd be super helpful to that one customer, but it's not going to be helpful to a whole lot of other people. So what I tend to fall back on is really explaining our vision for what Baremetrics is. So saying like that's a fantastic feature request, but it's really not in line with what we're the direction we're trying to go, and then share some of the direction that we're going in with them and say like, here's what we're trying to build. And what I find is folks are pretty understanding. They go, oh, okay, I see how what I'm asking for doesn't fit in that vision. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
That's worked really well.
I think as well, sometimes you can spend to customers that kind of what they're looking for is already out there and it's done better by other people. And so a typical one that I've seen, it's not actually related to Kayako, it was in one of my previous companies, but we had requests where someone said, it'd be really great if we could actually take payments from you, because that's it's going to save us a lot of time. And we're like, well, we're not really like a company that can do security to that level. We can't write our own payments kind of gateways and stuff. There's a lot of security there. There's a lot of like kind of international requirements and a lot of like banking regulations and stuff. And so really you want to kind of use a third party that does that and specializes in that and just use their portal effectively.
Yeah, and it's sometimes tempting to turn down those things too, right? Because one request we get a lot is that people want us to be to reach out to their customers because we already have so much information in Baremetrics about their customer base. They go, you have all these email addresses here. It'd be great if we could automatically email them. And we look at other companies that do that kind of thing, like Intercom, for example, and think, oh man, there's a lot of money to be made there. But then what we're getting way too sidetracked from the actual thing that we want to build. So again, just kind of coming back to that vision for what it is that we want to build and explaining that to folks is I think the best way to go.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is like I guess the other side you'll get is maybe not feature requests, but sometimes you'll get requests from customers to do a certain little change or something for them, or work the product in a certain way to do something they're trying to achieve, and it's kind of not best fit, and kind of the customer is saying to you, this is like really important to me, and sometimes they don't understand that it's not just making that change now, after you've made that change, you're going to have to support it from now going forward through all your versions, through all your releases. You're always going to have to think about that little change that you've made for someone and bring that forward through all the iterations. And so it ends up having quite a high kind of support cost for that change that you've made.
Yeah. I haven't encountered that too much just yet. Typically, people are asking for much larger feature requests so far. How do you guys typically handle that? Like, I imagine, with help desk software, there's so many little tweaks that people are wanting to make.
Well, we're quite lucky because our software has kind of a really good API that people can use, and they can also actually build their own integrations as well. And so sometimes we'll say to customers, if it's kind of like really important to them, they can actually leverage the API to actually achieve that for themselves. And then the benefit of that is, as we release upgrades, it doesn't break their integrations or what they've done because our API is always consistent, and so the kind of work they're putting into it is worthwhile. But it also doesn't cost us any extra time in development as well. And so kind of products, so products that have those APIs and those integrations I feel don't suffer as badly from that kind of issue. If that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. That actually reminds me, one thing that type of requests we get a lot are, you have this data, why can't you do this calculation with it, or why can't you present it in this way? So the way that we've kind of resolved that is we've made just about every metric that we provide exportable to a CSV. So if you get that very specific request for a very specific thing, you can just tell folks, hey, just export that data and take into Excel and do your thing. Have fun. And that's worked really well.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. I think as well, it's like another thing that you've got to make sure you don't do sometimes, and I guess it's more of a problem for sales, but it can be a problem for your support eventually as well, is sometimes if you make those little tweaks for people, you kind of onboarded like a non-ideal customer, and the issue you've got with that is that customer's probably never going to be happy. And so although they're with you, they're always going to kind of give you kind of poor kind of CSAT scores, poor NPS, etc., because they really shouldn't probably be with your company. They should be with a company that actually better suits what they're looking for. So sometimes it's quite important to let the customer know that you're not actually the best option for them, and something actually else might suit better.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those sort of situations, you're not just it's not just a disservice to the customer to try to convince them to use your product even though it's not the best fit. It's a disservice to yourself, because at the end of the day, like you mentioned, you're going to have to keep supporting that imperfect fit for as long as they stick around. And ultimately, they're probably going to leave anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and being kind of transparent, it can kind of maybe have the opposite effect as well, which can be quite useful, where the customer might be kind of a little bit more unhappy to start with because you said, no, we're not going to do that, and you explained why you can't do that. But now you set that boundary, if the customer sticks with you, they're actually going to probably end up happier and be more loyal because you're being honest and they know exactly what to expect as they're using the product.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a similar thing like that, or something that relates to that recently, where we discontinued a feature that was really important to quite a few people, but not many people overall were using it. It was the ability to import outside transactions. So we discontinued it, and our initial thought was, oh man, everybody who uses this feature is just going to leave. But we took a very, very transparent approach, and we just straight up told people, we said, hey, not enough people are using this. It's really, really difficult to support. It's taking a lot of time. And I'm sorry, we're going to have to discontinue it. And we thought they were all going to leave, and most of them stayed. We were shocked. And I think it draws back to what you're talking about, is that if you kind of create that trust and set the right expectation, you'd be surprised what happens, right?
Well, indeed. And then think of all like the development time you saved by dropping that feature, and your customers are now all going to benefit from things that you can add, which they're probably going to make more use of.
Yeah, exactly. Things are going to have higher impact for more people.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on to our third question of today, and this is basically about being transparent at kind of at the worst time, when things go wrong. And so I do have like a little slide that I put together just to kind of highlight this a little bit more, just so it's a bit clear about what we mean about kind of being transparent in terms of support. So if we take the fact we've had a disaster, and you'll see here on the screen we kind of got here. We're being totally transparent.
That's something on fire. So that's pretty disastrous, exactly. For sure. Mm-hmm.
And well, the way that I'm kind of viewing this is, if you look at how we've said it to the customer. So we said here, our main core routing switch is just blown up. I mean, literally, it's on fire, and our fire suppression system is just drenched all of our equipment, and so everything's kind of broken. It's a complete mess, and there's only 2 guys that we've got in our company that can fix this, and unfortunately they're actually both on holiday today, and so now we're going to have to wait for them to get in before we can actually help you. And when a customer kind of reads that, when you're being totally transparent, the image I get in my head is of that burning house. And so things are completely out of control, and kind of literally the house is burning down effectively, and it kind of makes me distrust the customer, not because they haven't been transparent, but because it kind of makes me think they're not running it properly. I'm worried about maybe, do they take security seriously, and kind of raises a lot of questions because of the way I've been transparent.
Yeah, and somebody's lying to you, and sometimes you can tell they're lying to you because they use like 10 excuses in that lie, like, oh, I can't come tonight because like my leg is broken, and like I don't have my car, and I'm sick, and blah 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 blah, right? It almost comes off like that, right? Like you're just like giving excuse after excuse after excuse, so it loses its impact or its meaning.
Yeah, for sure.
So I see what you're getting at here, that like you can still be transparent, but maybe distill that down to the information that's important for the customer to know, right?
Yeah, so on my next slide, I've got the exact same issue that the customers had, but I've changed the wording slightly on that transparency to be kind of like a little bit less transparent, but hopefully more helpful to the customer. And so you'll see here, we're now basically saying, I'm sorry this is affecting you. We've suffered a critical hardware failure on one of our core systems. We are working as quickly as we can to fix that, but we expect it to take a couple of hours before we can be in a position to let you know how long it's going to take us to resolve this problem for you. And kind of, when you read that, you understand they've had a critical failure, and you know it's going to take time before they can even tell you how long it's going to take to fix it. But the image I have in my head from reading that is kind of, there's a bunch of people in a server room, they're working together, they're trying to resolve the problem, and so although I'm maybe irritated the fact that there's been a service outage, I don't have kind of like a loss of confidence in the company, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would take it a step further too, and be, I'm going to coin a term here, transparent upon request. So if the customer then turns to you and says, oh, well, what happened? Like, how did you get into this situation? At least for me, I'm more than happy to explain everything when they're asking for it, right? But I think the trap that you can fall into is just over-explaining what happened when they're not even asking that, right? They want to know how long it's going to take, and that's it, for the most part.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, they want to know how long it's going to affect them effectively. I mean, one thing that we do at Kayako, if we do have an incident, and kind of touch wood, we don't have them very often, but if we do have them, we do actually post on our support site kind of like a post-mortem, and we tell customers kind of what happened and what we're going to do to actually make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again. And I think customers are quite forgiving as long as you do learn from your mistakes. So if you have done something and there's a way to improve that, and you actually implement that and improve that so it doesn't happen again, I think that kind of breeds more loyalty with customers because they know you're responsible and kind of looking after the shop.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you are transparent, especially in a B2B setting, like other companies have had outages and have experienced this stuff before, so they understand being in that situation just as much as you do. So as long as you're providing consistent updates or constant updates, I think generally the reaction is going to be pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest mistake that I see a lot of companies make is when they'll kind of post on, like for example, on Twitter, they'll kind of try and take the I guess you'd say the corporate approach, and they'll kind of like, we're sorry for the inconvenience, we're working as hard as we can, we'll update you soon, and kind of you'll get one of those tweets come out maybe like every 8 hours or something, and it's kind of, you're just thinking to yourself, I've got no idea how long is it going to be down, and more importantly, is my data secure, what's actually happened, and I think kind of if you're a bit more transparent about kind of what the issues actually happened, is how it affects the customer. Is their data safe? That's one thing they're going to want to know straight away, and then they might want to know as well how long you expect it to be down. And if you can kind of maybe give them even a rough idea of it's definitely going to be down for the next couple of hours at least, and we'll update after that. At least you're setting expectations to kind of keep them informed.
Absolutely, and I think when you're doing that too, you have to not be afraid to eat your own words a little bit. So you might say, we think this is going to take 2 hours, and it ends up taking 4 hours. Well, I would rather set like an expectation and be wrong than to just give vague updates, right?
Yeah,
I would rather say we're pretty sure it's going to be 2 hours and have it end up being 4, if it comes to it.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're giving the customer kind of informed and up to date as that's happening. So if maybe like 10 minutes in it's going to be more than 2 hours, then let them know, rather than kind of just like waiting for the time to come out to 4 hours and go, no, we fixed it. So as long as you have the regular updates, I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, don't say it's going to be 2 hours and then don't update for 4 hours. That would be a terrible idea. But certainly, yeah, don't be afraid to be wrong with those sort of updates and have to correct yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think we're kind of at the end of our questions here. So let's just have a quick check whether or not we've had any kind of questions from customers. So I have been passed a couple here. So someone's basically said here is how do you handle or be transparent when having to transfer a customer? So maybe you've got a customer and you kind of pass them between agents, and they come to you and you've got to pass them on to someone else. What's the best way to handle that?
Well, this is small company perspective, but I think the best way to handle that would be to avoid having to ever do that. But I understand in some cases you have no choice. I think in that case it's helpful to talk up the person that you're transferring them to. Be like, oh, you need help with this. John is fantastic with these sorts of issues. I'm going to get him to jump in and help you. So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to transfer you to another department. You're making it a little bit more personal.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, I think the biggest failure you can have here is to say, sorry, I can't help you with this. I'm going to pass it on to someone else that hopefully can help you. That's the wrong approach. I think really you want to try and own that position a little bit and say, I'm sorry that that's happened to you. Give me a moment here to understand what's happened to you. I'm going to find you the right person to help you. And then, yes, I'm going to have to transfer you, but the person I give you to will absolutely be able to help you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this question gives me nightmares of, calling in for telephone support for, a huge company or something, and they just transfer you to another phone bank. And I think as much as you can avoid that sensation or feeling, the better.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think what helps too, especially in that situation, is if your kind of customer support software can kind of make sure that even when you're transferring that person to person, the history of that conversation is not lost. Because the worst thing as a customer is when someone transfers you and you've got to explain over and over again exactly what's happened to you and go through the entire thing every time you get transferred. I think that's part of like the most frustrating thing for me. And so if you make sure you have service software that can kind of keep that together so that even when you're passing the agents, they can still actually help you, not have to keep on asking the same questions, that's obviously a big bonus.
Oh, absolutely. I've definitely dealt with online support before where I've no joke, created my own text expander that just explains everything that's gone wrong so that I can just use that every time I have to email with a new agent. Thought about doing that on the phone too, like pre-recording something, but that's probably a little bit getting a little carried away there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact that there's probably software for it is probably a testament to how bad it is in the real world and how often that happens.
Oh, for sure. It can be pretty brutal. Fortunately, though, it seems like a lot of companies, or big companies especially, are doing a lot better job of improving that support experience. So that's good. Good for us.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we have another question here. I feel like we've maybe answered a little bit, but let's just quickly recap it.
And then quick things for folks who are listening, you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar panel here. So if there's anything you want to know, by all means, type it in now, and we'll get to it.
Yeah, you can either ask it in the questions box, but you can also tweet us at Transparent Success as well, and we'll pick it up from there as well. If there is any questions that we don't get to answer today, if we run out of time, we will follow up with you after the webinar as well and cover those for you. So the next question here is how to be tactful when letting a customer know their request isn't on your roadmap. So we've kind of covered that obviously a little bit, but let's just kind of recap on kind of what we decided was the best thing.
Yeah. So I'll recap on kind of my thing because I found this works really well. Is to explain it's not on our roadmap and then try to let the customer into what our vision is for our roadmap so that they understand why it's not on our roadmap. And then at that point, if that feature request is incredibly important to them, well, maybe they're going to go to another company and find it there, and that's totally okay. Because again, you don't want to be doing a disservice to them by saying, oh yeah, we might build that in 6 months, and then they stick around and you never build it.
Yeah, no, indeed, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the key, is explaining your vision and kind of the boundaries of your own kind of product or service. As long as that's kind of set and people understand that, they then can be more forgiving about why it can't do certain things.
Yeah, exactly. They'd be like, oh, of course you wouldn't build that feature because it doesn't make sense with what you're trying to build. So, yeah, that's worked really, really well for us.
Okay, and we've got a question for you directly, Kaegan. Someone says to you, what's something you wish Baremetrics was more transparent about?
I think the big one for us is actually our roadmap And it's not because we don't want to be transparent about our roadmap, and I am transparent on our support requests, but I would love to just put our roadmap up on like a Trello board or something like that and have everybody be able to look at it. But it changes so much. Like, we're a very agile company, so we'll often, we'll have like the next 6 months planned out. We'll build one of those features, and then all of a sudden that'll uncover this other direction that we need to take, and that whole, next 6 months that we'd planned gets thrown out the window. So we aren't super transparent with our roadmap for that reason, because we're not certain that it's going to stay that way, and we don't want to disappoint people.
Yeah, no, I can understand that for sure. I mean, I guess that's probably something that software companies get the most often, is kind of transparency over their roadmaps and stuff. I think we did actually have a webinar we did a while back about that as well, which people might want to check out, because that probably covers it in a bit more detail. But I think kind of with that, it comes down to relative transparency, because the worst thing you can do is tell people, for example, timelines when you're not confident you can meet them. And so you should make public what you can, but obviously, especially on a roadmap that's changing all the time, it's not so easy to kind of put down in stone effectively when things are actually going to get released.
Yeah, and that bit me in the butt a few times actually when I first started out at Baremetrics, because I would, I had basically permission to be as transparent as I wanted. There wasn't any information that had to be withheld from customers. So, in the first few months after I started, somebody would write in and say, "Hey, I need this feature. When are you going to release it?" And I'd go and look at the roadmap, and I'd say, "Oh, it says 3 months," and I would tell them that. And eventually, before long, I had built up this like semi-angry mob of people who were expecting a feature to be delivered, and we didn't deliver it for another 6 months. So, because I was basically saying, yes, we are going to ship it in 2 months, and I didn't know better. I assumed that was like a golden tablet of what we were going to do with absolute certainty, and it didn't work out that way. So, yeah. So I learned that lesson. To be a little bit more, be open, but be a bit more ambiguous about it. So saying, like, the plan is for now to ship this in the next few months. Things could change.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we have another question, and someone's basically saying here, when you're giving status updates on an outage, kind of, what are the guidelines that you think is a good idea about kind of how often you should do that? And because they're worrying, for example, about fatigue, but maybe you're tweeting out too often, or you're sending out too many emails, and kind of that then starts kind of bugging the customer because you're doing it too often.
I think my general rule of thumb is every 30 to 45 minutes, or if there is a major update, right? So say you're working for 2 hours and nothing is changing. Well, okay, every 30, 45 minutes, say you're still working on it, but we don't have any updates. And then if some big change happens, then you can tweet more often than that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it probably matters as well, kind of maybe like the scale of the interruption as well. And so if it's like, there's certain aspects of something that someone can't do, so maybe they can't use a certain part of the feature or something, then maybe that should be less often because it's not so critical. But if you've actually impacted their entire business and they literally can't operate because of this downtime, then they're going to want the updates, because there's nothing else they can do. They're literally watching for updates. And so at that point in time, you then want to be a bit more often, because obviously they're going to want information.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas if it's an outage that only affects, one particular feature and not everybody uses that, you don't really need to be emailing them every 30 minutes to say, hey, this thing you don't use isn't working. That's
for sure.
not especially helpful for your customers at that point.
Okay, so we've had another question, and someone says here, was there ever a time that being transparent has ended badly for you? Good question.
Well, my example from before, where I was being really transparent about our roadmap, yep, that was bad. Another one was, so that feature I mentioned earlier that I said we discontinued, we were originally going to rewrite it to work with a new system that we were building out, and we've been moving people over to this new system for the past few months. So originally we were telling people, hey, we're going to move you over soon, we're working on this, we're going to move you over soon, we're working on this, and for a few months, and then we had to come back around and say, yeah, you know what, actually we're not going to be able to build that. So that was one of those cases where us being really transparent could have ended kind of badly. Fortunately, as I mentioned previously, though, people were pretty understanding about why we weren't able to build it, so it worked out okay.
Okay. So I think we've got time for one last question before we're out of time today. And so let's end it on, how do you respond to a client asking for a refund that the company really can't grant?
That we can't grant?
Well, as in general, a client's asked for a refund, and unfortunately, you're not in a position to actually give that refund. So, kind of, how do you deal with a client in that situation?
That's a tricky one. I can't imagine why you wouldn't be able to give a refund unless that was like your last $10, and after that, the company's going to go bankrupt, right? You can.
I feel like this is maybe like a support staff asking this, and they've said to their boss, "This customer wants a refund," and the boss has said, "No, that's not happening." So you're having to go back and say, "It's not been authorized." I guess it's the way it boils down, and I'm guessing they're looking for help on how you'd address that.
See, that's hard for me to answer because thankfully I've always worked for companies where, as a support, even just as a support agent, you get to make that final call, right? So you usually would go to your superior and say, I want to refund this customer. This is why, and as long as you have a good reason for it, your superior says okay. So I feel bad for the person who asked this question. That's a tricky thing to be in.
I think the way to try and help with this is if you can't give a refund, try and give something out that which is still valuable in some way. So maybe,
for
example,
like the gift of laughter or something.
Well. Yes, that kind of works, but I was thinking more kind of maybe like, if they're paying like on a monthly, like per month thing, maybe giving them a month free if you can, or kind of, just try and give something that you can give, which isn't actually a refund.
Yeah, and actually, I just thought of this here. If they're canceling and they also want a refund, sometimes you can dig into the reason why they're canceling. It might turn out that they're looking for a particular feature that you do actually have, or they didn't know how to use something, or they were frustrated getting something set up. So you might be able to just even like backtrack beyond the refund and beyond the cancellation and actually fix the root problem for that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Oftentimes a refund is people will ask for a refund out of frustration, and if you can get to the bottom of that frustration, then you might be able to prevent it altogether.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with that, we're actually out of time today. If you have got any questions, feel free to ask them. You can kind of still use it in Twitter and tweet at us, and we'll answer those questions after the webinar if we have actually missed any. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Kaegan, for joining us today. It's been really good.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.